importance of NATO. This event that we're gathering for today is something that has been a long time coming for the NATO Association. Our job is to inform Canadians, but also other citizens of the world, just what NATO is, why it's important, and why everybody should pay attention to what's going on globally. Because it's an exciting story, and storytelling is something that we at the NATO Association have not necessarily been that great at. And what we wanted to do is to try to assess how we might do that, how we might be able to drive home the very importance of the entity that we are talking about and we are educating Canadians about. It's something that I think a lot of organizations are dealing with right now. We've got 4 outstanding panelists to talk about this today. But before we do, I just wanted to remind our viewers why storytelling is so important. It's something that brings us together. It's something that allows us to understand the world. As I'm sure most of you will appreciate, with the advance of digital communications and so many different platforms, there are lots of different ways where people are coming together, forging new bonds, meeting new people, expanding the horizons. But I'm sure, like you have heard a lot about the atomization, the echo chambers, the ways that it is isolating people so that they don't hear new ideas and don't feel like larger organizations or don't identify with larger organizations. For the past few hundred years, we have been moving towards greater imagined communities, whether that be a nation, whether that be a company, and in this case, an international organization or an international rules-based order. Let me just tell you a little bit what do I mean about that. At the end of the Second World War, after millions upon millions of deaths, countless displacements, and real suffering throughout the entire globe, leaders got together and said, never again. Never again will we allow ourselves to descend into such barbary and to such wanton destruction. And some of the lessons that were learned from the Second World War were put into action in organizations like the United Nations, NATO itself, the Bretton Woods financial organizations, the International Criminal Court, and many other multilateral organizations you've probably never heard of or considered. They have helped to create a lattice work of resilience and problem solving. And that's one of the greatest things we've ever achieved. My personal background's history, so I'm always looking at things with a fairly large horizon. And when you do that, when you zoom out of our current day and age, which seems to be quite chaotic and complex, we are actually in an amazing period of peace and flourishing for humanity. And I think it's really important that we recognize why that is. And a lot of that is due to the international rules-based order of which NATO is a part, because it's based on problem solving and collaboration upon a group of people coming together and deciding to work together for the good of all. And that's what's been called non-zero sum collaboration. And it can do wonders, and it has done wonders. And that's an amazing story. And it's a story that people could feel excited about being a part of. It's something that you can cast yourself in as if it were an epic. These words that I say are actually very reminiscent of, say, the late 19th century or the early 20th century, when this was very common, this idea of seeing yourself within the sweep of history and the ideas of progress. They've been maligned and criticized for certainly the past 50 years and very much out of vogue since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the so-called end of history, wherein stories kind of ended because there was a success. There was a final triumph of problem solving and collaboration of Western democracies. So once you win, it's not that exciting anymore. There's no challenge, there's no story to weave. And we kind of gave up on that kind of impression, that sort of explanation for our lives, positioning ourselves in such a story. And I think we have to talk about how we might be able to resuscitate that kind of an idea, because it helps to give meaning. It helps to place people in a sensible view of the world, which can really help bring people together. And the proof is in the pudding, and it's given us so much peace and relative security that we cannot take it for granted. This all started, in my mind, for the NATO Association when we did a poll 2 years ago with Ipsos Public Affairs, and it found out that 71% of Canadians did not know what NATO was. That's a failure of education, sure, but it's also a failure of storytelling. And that's what I want to explore. How can we get really into a few ideas about how NATO can bring itself into a story, bring other people into its story. So in order to do that today, I'm really thrilled to introduce our panel. I'll introduce them one by one as they give their presentations. But first of all, I'm absolutely honored to have Brigadier-General Jay Janzen with us today. He has served as an armored officer for the first decade of his career and subsequently spent the last 22 years working in military strategic communication. His deployments include Bosnia in 1994 and 2 tours in Afghanistan, 2003, 2004, and 2008 and 2009. From 2012 to 2015, he was the Chief of Media Operations for Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, or SHAPE. He was awarded the NATO Meritorious Service Medal for his role as a leading communications strategist during the Russia-Ukraine crisis. He is a graduate of the Royal Roads Military College, the NATO Defence College, and the National Security Program. Brigadier-General Janzen spent the past 2 years building strategic communication capacity for the Canadian Armed Forces and is now Director General of Public Affairs. General, please take us away.
Thank you, Robert. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be on this distinguished panel. I'm going to talk to you this morning about the cognitive science behind stories, what makes them work with the human brain. And then I'm going to talk for a little while about how our potential adversaries are leveraging this science and these techniques. And then I'll conclude with some recommendations for NATO. I'm just going to share my screen. All right. So, stories are as old as humankind. And scientists tell us that our brains are hardwired to make sense of the world around us using stories. And cognitive scientists will also tell us that your brain is 22 times more likely to remember facts when they're rolled up into a story, as opposed to just some random facts alone. 22 times. So how is NATO doing at telling stories? Well, I would say actually pretty good in compared to many large and complex organizations. And you can see an example here from NATO's digital content. They do tell stories. They do focus on people. But we have to recognize, first and foremost, that the alliance is operating at a bit of a disadvantage. Why? NATO follows the rules. It has values. It doesn't engage in tactics like some of our adversaries do, the tactics of weaponizing information, using false information. And that's a problem. And it's a problem because sensational stories, false stories, rumors, they travel about 7 times faster. They're more attractive to our brains than is information that is trustworthy and grounded in fact. The Kremlin knows this, and they are perfecting their techniques in terms of how to leverage some of this cognitive science online and through other mediums in order to gain and hold our attention. Some of you might recognize this place. It's not the Canadian military's headquarters. It's actually IRA headquarters, not in Ireland, but in St. Petersburg, Russia. It's not a military facility. It's not even a government building. It was set up by an oligarch named Prigozhin, good friend of Vladimir Putin, who said, hey, we'll get a building. We're going to hire some cyber people, some information people, and we can mess with the West. we can divide their society, divide their alliances, cause friction and polarization at the heart of Western power. We see what they're doing in overseas conflicts like Ukraine. Here's some examples. They leverage outrageous stories. The more outrageous, the better. And they accuse their adversaries in order to undermine them. So some examples here, they accuse the Ukrainian government of organ harvesting, the crucifixion of children, employing slavery. They employed multiple theories about how Malaysian airliner's flight MH17 was shot down, even though they knew it was them that shot it down. These sensational stories are hard to counter. At home, they tap into history, culture, Russian pride. This particular image is taken from a show put on by the Night Wolves, which is a motorcycle club, but it's more than a motorcycle club. It's a means by which to project Russian narrative and Russian power. And this particular scene depicts the Maidan revolutions that happened in Ukraine. And their depiction of that is Nazis, torch-wielding Nazis marching in the shape of a swastika. A very deliberate message behind this use of imagery, music, and entertainment in order to tell a story. In our own backyard, we see them doing similar things. They target our politics using well-known cultural icons, President Trump as Santa Claus. They amplify sensational accusations. They exploit religious division, religion, our popular stories. In this famous case, you know, if you like Jesus, then you're going to vote against Hillary Clinton. Religious divisions are exploited, whether it's the burqa, whether it's Sharia law. They also tap into just the plain bizarre. And who here hasn't heard of Pizzagate? And there are still people today who believe that Pizzagate actually happened. It was a real thing. They also look for anger and division in society, and any kind of divisive issue that we've got in our society or in our alliance, they will target that, they will exploit it. And again, cognitive science tells us that when you get angry, when you get outraged about something, your cognitive defenses are lowered and they can follow up with all kinds of additional information, and you are no longer able to detect that you are being lied to, that you are being manipulated. Some conspiracies can become very believable. They're more attractive than the truth, as I said, and this has real consequences. And we're in the middle of a pandemic now. Lots of people buying into strange conspiracy theories in spite of all evidence to the contrary. And the consequences are significant. In Canada, you know, we think of ourselves as a fairly enlightened, moderate culture, but there are people burning down cell phone towers because they believe that 5G causes COVID-19. Real consequences. Alarming numbers of our population are impacted by this. We are not immune. And this chart shows some of the more popular conspiracy theories around COVID and the numbers in our population who think that there's something behind those statements. Right up to 7% of our population in Canada, according to this poll, believe that COVID isn't even real. It's not even a thing. Robert spoke about echo chambers, and these are very dangerous. They help explain why people aren't processing these facts properly, because it's not because the information isn't out there. It's because these people are situated on 4chan, on Reddit, on some kind of space on the internet, and they are not looking at other information. They're not even considering other information. And you throw these cognitive factors in with the automation that's going on. And in this study showed us that in the first few months of COVID, 82% of the content on certain platforms was not generated by humans, but generated by machines. And projecting forward, We are getting very, very close to the point where it won't just be content propagated by machines, it will be content created by machines. And certain AI platforms now can write text without human intervention, and increasingly fewer and fewer people are able to discern the difference. So imagine when you can automate this at scale in real time using machines. So what should we be doing about this? How are we going to respond to this situation? Well, first, I think we have to remember what a narrative is. It's not just a clever story. We have to provide explanations. We have to explain the past, justify the present, and most importantly, present a vision for the future. And I would say that is a key challenge for NATO. And just to get narrative into its simplest form, some of the narratives that NATO has to explain, international peace and security or the rules-based order, these are complex. These are not inherently perhaps fascinating subjects. But just to highlight the challenge here, if I was to say, look, narrative at its simplest, what's a simple concept? A shape. And one person says, I'm here to tell you the story about a square. And believe me, this is the attractive narrative. And another says, no, the circle, that is the narrative that you must capture, that you must follow, because it's the most attractive. And the last person says, wait a minute, this is all about the triangle. We must follow the narrative of the triangle. So which one will be followed? Ultimately, this narrative, it's a competition between competing narratives. And how do you ensure that your narrative is the one that's selected? Well, the first thing you need to understand is, who are you trying to convince and where is their perspective? Because if the shape that you're trying to describe is the thing in the center, that complex subject, but your audience is approaching it from the bottom, and if you project light up on that shape, it's going to look very much like a triangle. And people from that particular perspective will be certain what they're seeing is a triangle. And you try to tell them that it's a circle, good luck. If your start point isn't, hey, triangle people, this is, we can see commonality. Here are the triangular aspects to this. That opens the door to future success. This isn't really new. Aristotle told us 2,000 years ago how to convince people using pathos, logos, and ethos. And he said, logic and facts, that's just 1/3 of what you actually need to do. You need to leverage emotion like marketers do, that pathos, but most importantly, it's ethos. You need that moral underpinning, and you need to have standing and credibility with the audience that you try to communicate with. So when we went to Afghanistan and tried to talk to illiterate villagers in remote parts of that country, dressed like this with all kinds of high-tech equipment and weapons and armor and sunglasses, how much standing did we have with those people as a start point for that conversation? The other thing we, again, need to get and understand their worldview. So of course, when we first went into Afghanistan as NATO, we tried to tell people, look, we want to tap into your culture. We're here because of Pashtunwali, which is an honor code. It's in response to what happened in America. We were dishonored, and we need to come to your country and restore our honor by dealing with Al-Qaeda. And so, we did a little bit of study and we thought that would work. It was a total failure early on in Afghanistan. And we didn't realize it for some time until we went around and just showed people pictures like this in rural Afghanistan and said, what is this? They had no idea. They'd never heard of the World Trade Center. They'd never heard of 9/11. And when we told them we were there to restore our honor, this is what they were thinking about. They were thinking about the Anglo-Afghan wars and, the very ingrained culturally significance that this has, which, by the way, the Taliban leveraged from day one. to explain what was going on. They wrapped their entire narrative into these conflicts. And so when we were speaking to Afghans early on in that conflict, we were enhancing the adversarial narrative and doing nothing for our own. You know, cognitive science tells us that facts aren't going to work anymore. Because people, if the facts are outside of what they believe, they won't even be considered. They won't even hear you. So we need to start with that overlapping space, what the audience we're trying to reach believes, and then what we can fit into that space. That is our maneuver space. And, you know, communicating as an institution like NATO, that is not going to work. We can't institutionally communicate. We need to communicate as people. And this is an example from exercise Trident Juncture, the biggest NATO exercise in some years that took place a little while ago. And I don't think this was on purpose, but by accident, this guy, Lieutenant Lars Loken Matterberg, emerged as a celebrity and a sensation because, well, the way he looked, he looked kind of like a Viking. He was a Norwegian lieutenant from the Royal Norwegian Navy. He was a fitness instructor, you know, very attractive guy, and he could tell a story. And he became almost bigger than the exercise itself. But if there's one thing I could leave you with, it's that we have to retain trust. Trust is the currency of narrative battle. So we can't use the same tactics as our adversaries. We've got to tell our stories our way, maintaining our values and our trust. I look forward to the discussion and hearing from the other presenters. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, General. That was just a delight. And I think it's going to fit really well in with our next presenter, Rafferty Jackson. We've had some great conversations leading up to this event. And when we started talking with Rafferty, it became apparent that her whole idea about discovering an organization's why and how important that is really a great thing that we should try to talk about, how NATO can, you know, really evidence its why. So Rafferty Jackson has worked with Beats by Dre, and since the Beats by Dre brand sailed to Apple for $3 billion, including Beats Music, she's moved to the North Face and brands reaching over 1 billion in sales in North America. Also taking Ubiquity software public on the alternative investment market on the London Stock Exchange, and selling it to Avaya Incorporated. Rafferty Jackson has led companies through hypergrowth, investments, global expansion, mergers, acquisitions, and IPO. She built her diverse career through leadership roles at these major market disruptors, repeatedly creating executive leadership roles requiring oversight, accountability, strategic planning, and execution, as well as collaboration across all company functions. Now at Jack Industries, she's focused on using her unique and valuable business insights created from all of her life and business experiences to fill leaders and founders with courage, new tools, and a strategy forward for them to storytell and transform company purpose into company culture, creating better businesses through better jobs, products, and services. She's also an Astia Angel, investing in women-led, founded, and invented companies, and a mentor of Seraphim Capital's Space Tech Accelerator program in London. Rafferty has a special passion for the new space industry, which is a great story in and of itself, and works with technical founders to storytell their technical visions to non-technical audiences. And if there was ever a technical organization, that would be NATO, I think. Rafferty, we're absolutely thrilled to have you join us.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. Let me go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to go ahead and reshare that because I'm sure I missed hitting the key buttons for audio. Okay. Are we all set?
Good to go.
Great, thank you. "30,000 years ago, a storyteller wanted to tell us today about rhinos, horses, bison, and more. Storytelling is how we communicate who we are and what we stand for. Compelling stories are felt so deeply that they are retold generation to generation on new walls, including on our skin. Storytelling is how we teach our children the rules for living in our community, for being in our culture. It teaches ethics and right from wrong. It sets the guardrails for decision-making, like be nice, don't lie, and think before acting. Don't play with fire. Sometimes storytelling is life and death. In World War II, UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill made it clear the UK would not surrender.
We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender.
Sometimes storytelling has to convince an audience to do the unimaginable. Here, US President Kennedy states without limitations that America is going to the moon within the decade, even though America did not have the technology.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
And sometimes storytelling just needs you to understand what is happening. This is Steve Jobs' 2007 speech introducing the iPhone. My favorite part of the speech is the reaction from the audience when he introduces a particular software feature. Usually you don't even get a nod for a software feature.
Well, how do I scroll through my list of artists? How do I do this? I just take my finger and I scroll. That's it.
How do storytellers get those gasps? Storytellers know their why. They know their personal why and their company why. The personal why is that unique why that drives an individual to get out of bed and put their energy towards their goals, overcoming all obstacles and difficulties. It is why you get up in the morning when you were rejected the day before. Storytellers also know their company why or their professional purpose, that drive that aligns a group of people to an end goal. Churchill wanted his country to know that surrender was not an option. Great Britain was fighting to the death. Kennedy believed the US would lose the Cold War if the Soviets beat America to the moon. He left no room for failure or delay in his speech. And Jobs knew that phones had already come and gone. He had a great product, but it didn't mean Apple would win the consumer heart. He needed to storytell what an iPhone was and what it did. When you storytell your why, you can get these reactions. She's leaning. She's trying to get around the girl in front of her to see the storyteller. She's so mesmerized, she stopped drinking her cocoa. And this, the gasp, is what we are all going for. Let me tell you a tale of two whys, two very different whys, each equally successful. This is Dr. Bose, an incredible inventor, a PhD in electrical engineering from MIT and founder of his namesake company, Bose, the maker of headphones and speakers. In honor of MIT's 150th year, the Boston Globe listed the top 150 MIT inventors of all time. Dr. Bose was 9th. He was ahead of the founders of HP, Genentech, the co-inventor of GPS. Dr. Bose's passion and drive for invention is clear in the Bose company why. We apply the highest level of scientific inquiry and invention. Dr. Bose's passion for science and invention drives his company, and you can see it in their commercials.
QC20 headphones are the first in-ear noise-canceling headphones from Bose, with revolutionary technology that lets you enjoy better sound every day, everywhere you go. We completely re-engineered our acclaimed acoustic noise-canceling technology to offer an unprecedented level of noise reduction in headphones this small, so whatever noise surrounds you, you'll enjoy some peace and quiet. If you want to add your own soundtrack, Bose proprietary tri-port headphone technology and active equalization give your music a full, balanced sound you wouldn't expect from in-ear headphones.
You know for a fact, these earphones are built from the best science available. This is a serious product with many technical innovations and inventions. Now, let me tell you about another why. This is Dr. Dre and Jimmy Iovine, the founders of Beats by Dr. Dre, where I worked. Jimmy and Dre are prolific music producers, living legends, creators of music, emotion, and culture. These are just a handful of the artists Dre and Jimmy founded or produced. Only the music producer knows exactly what the final version of a song sounds like. Sitting at the mixing boards, hundreds of hours of turning knobs, moving sliders up and down, taking out that beat, adding in that snare tap. With the revolution of digital playback devices like iPods, MP3 players, and phones, came the cheap 25-cent earphones that destroyed audio fidelity. The song was perfect on the device. The lousy earphone that came in the box with the device killed it. Jimmy and Dre launched Beats by Dre in 2009 to teach us to throw out those in-box earphones and buy real headphones. Headphones like what Jimmy and Dre wore in the music studio, headphones that let you hear the music. Our company why reflected our founders' why. We connect you to the emotion of your music. The emotion that Jimmy and Dre felt as they produced music, the emotion consumers felt when they actually heard, really heard, their favorite song as the artist intended. And our commercials showed it.
I'm picking up real sketch vibes. My woman's been telling me lies about other men, about where she's been hanging. White lies you try, can't blind my eyes. You got your red dress on and you wanna play like I can't know things that I've never seen. White lies you try, can't blind my eyes.
You feel the emotion through that song, the colors, the people. There are no technical features, no inventions, just emotion, just music. The only words are the name of the artist and the song. Similar products, two very different whys, both equally successful. Why matters. Even if you are not a head of state or a CEO or a global brand, every single one of us is making decisions every day, and our whys are the foundation of those decisions, our rights from wrong. Scientific inquiry and invention. It's no surprise that Dr. Bose gifted most of his Bose stock to MIT to ensure its mission of research continues. Connection and emotion. Consumers loved Beats, and Apple did too. Beats was purchased for $3 billion only 6 years after launching. Storytelling matters. Every single one of us is storytelling all the time. We are storytelling to our bosses when we are asking for new responsibilities. We are storytelling to a landlord when we want to rent a new apartment. We are storytelling to our families and to ourselves. If part of your why is to be an honest and kind person, then you're not going to steal money from an unattended cash register. Such an act would not fit your story, would not fit your why. or its rights from its wrongs. At Beats, we had our why, and it was led by two of the greatest storytellers of our generation. When Beats had less than 50 employees, all on one floor in a building in Los Angeles, it was easy to know the Beats story of right and wrong. Employees met with or saw Jimmy and Dre daily. They saw artists like Lady Gaga in the product room trying on her namesake earphones. They saw Jimmy on American Idol with Beats headphones around his neck. But by the time we were sold, we had 600 employees in 7 countries. Even in LA, we were spread over a few floors in a few buildings. How did all those people know the Beats story? Those 550 employees who were not there at the start, who may never have seen Jimmy or Dre in person, who may not know about hip hop. I led the team of employees, many of whom had been there from the start, to figure out how we were going to storytell, who we were and what we stood for. We needed our internal story, the Beats why, so employees knew what the guardrails were for their decision-making, our rights from wrongs, our don't lie, be nice. Written on the board in this brainstorming session are some of our key beliefs. A critical guardrail turned out to be that first one. Don't say no, hustle a solution. If we wanted to deliver connection to emotion, we had to have a yes and mindset. We had to react quickly to cultural events. We couldn't be naysayers. We couldn't be negative. We had to connect our emotions to our tasks and set our mind to always find a solution. Our internal storytelling fueled Beats, kept us tightly aligned, and when we expanded globally, we hit $1 billion in sales. Even music legends wanted to be part of Beats. Eminem broke a new song in our commercial, not on a radio show, not on a TV show, but on a commercial. Athletes also wanted to be part of Beats. Our headphones connected them to the emotion of their music before competing, giving them focus, connecting them to their greatness. What was more important, though, than all of these celebrities and athletes were all the people we never met who made the story of Beats their own story on their skin. I couldn't find any Bose tattoos, but I know they're out there because STEM fans are just as passionate as Beats fans. Just like Beats and Bose, you have your why. You need to build the guardrails of that why and then go tell the story. We all know how these stories ended. But at the time we listened to these storytellers earlier, they did not know how the story would end. They had their why, death over surrender, to the moon and back, a phone in everyone's pocket, and they set their guardrails of rights and wrongs and told their story. You are now telling the story of NATO for the 21st century. And today, none of us knows how that story ends. What are your don't say no, hustle a solution, guardrails for decision-making? What are your be nice, don't lie, be safe, don't play with fire beliefs? How are you teaching what peace, prosperity, and security really means in this story? You have the why. Now set the guardrails, get those gasps, and get that story retold. Thank you.
Outstanding, Rafferty. Thanks so much. And I'm not commenting on whether I'm getting a NATO tattoo, but we'll see how it goes. But I love that, and also the connecting with emotion is something you don't necessarily see every day in trying to deal with NATO operations and explaining them. Even when we go down to the granular level and look at the different people, as General Janzen was talking about, the emotion is something that's just so essential and we can't forget here. So thanks so much for that.
You're welcome. I'm having trouble stopping the share, so let's see. There we go.
Go.
Great.
Wonderful. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
All right, I'm pleased to now introduce Kristina Paider, who's going to take us a little bit through character DNA. Kristina is a world-class business strategist and screenwriter. Her company, The Hollywood Approach, is a platform that leverages the art and neuroscience of story to help people accelerate results in their business and life. KP's executive track record includes overseeing the marketing and research for a 10 billion global hotel advisory company, and prior to that, 2 hotel tech companies, all while moonlighting as a screenwriter, which of course brings us back to the whole Hollywood aspect. Her action thriller script sold this summer. Her book comes out in February, and we'll be having our own event with her at that time. She travels by motorcycle, jumps into waterfalls, and is a guest chocolate chef who says that business is the most dynamic medium there is for story. We'll try to compete with that as far as international security is concerned. But Kristina, thanks so much for joining us. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Robert. It's a pleasure to be here. As we know, Hollywood is known for masterful stories that transcend time and space. Movies inspire all of us, and we also inspire movies. But why Hollywood? Let's take a look. Last year in 2019, the global entertainment market reached a new high, $101 billion. That's triple what it was 10 years prior in 2009, according to the Motion Picture Association of America. The world is becoming more globalized, and the way in which we share and consume stories is too. So as the oldest and largest film industry in the world, Hollywood has been the biggest influence on storytelling globally in modern times. So we may think in part, yeah, that's for theaters and big budget action movies. What does Hollywood storytelling have to do with NATO storytelling and business storytelling and real life? And why should we be thinking about this? We should think about it because our audience, our customers, are consuming story that is heavily influenced by Hollywood in epic proportions. Every story and character our audience and customers tune into is crafted in some form or fashion with Hollywood influence. On average, we, the royal global we, are consuming 4 to 5 hours of television a day. This is according to multiple studies, Eurodata and Nielsen are 2 of them, done around the world on markets around the world. So that's the same amount of time we spent learning, reading, and writing in 4th grade or getting our master's degree. So if we multiply that by even 2 or 10 or 20 years, that's a lot of studying. That's a lot of time consuming Hollywood-based stories. And these figures are from before the pandemic. So Hollywood storytelling has a major influence. This means that we, as well as our audience and our customers around the world, have become sophisticated story consumers, whether in theaters, blogs, YouTube, or social media. We have a way that we know, like, and trust the characters we relate to and the stories we tune into, wherever and however we tune into them. The safe, overly formal, 2-dimensional storytelling that used to get a passing grade in business and general and in news will not cut it in today's market. There is simply too much competition for our attention. If we think we can maintain an advantage out there in the wild and not acknowledge and leverage at least some of Hollywood's ninja-rific storytelling methods, we are missing out. And nobody wants to miss out, right? Nobody has to. My goal today is to bring you a vantage point that you may not have considered or may not have had access to before. A vantage point from inside Hollywood writing rooms and production companies where stories are crafted and developed to delight audiences, compete for attention, and compete for sequel and prequel potential, maybe even a cult following. but a cult following in the good way, not the bad way. So the investment of tens of millions of dollars in a film demands the precision of storytelling craft like no other medium. What's cool is these same exact rules can be applied to other organizations and other situations, and especially other media, for equally compelling results. So let's start here with a simple look at the Hollywood story framework. At its core, a Hollywood story has three components. These components, when combined, form the framework that allows a story to be told in anywhere from one line to a full 2-hour movie. It's this. Character plus goal plus obstacles create the story. So all of the structures that we know and love from journalism, from marketing, from screenwriting, from the screenwriting greats can be condensed into these three elements. They are structures like Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey, which is 12 steps. Blake Snyder's Save the Cat beat sheet, which is 17 steps. Paul Chitlick's Rewrite, 7 steps, and Linda Seeger's cornerstone book, Making a Good Script Great. I love all of these and use all of these. And all of these can be, again, boiled back down to this foundation of character, goal, and obstacles. So let's take a look at an example, The Bourne Identity. This is a story about an amnesiac who wants to recover his identity and must overcome flashbacks, assassins, and minimal information in order to find out who he is. So today we're going to talk about the driving force behind all stories. It's one of these elements, and in my opinion, it's the most critical element. It's character. So there's no Bourne Identity without Jason Bourne. It is the character who shapes the heart of every story. Stories are about characters doing things. They're about people doing things. So it doesn't matter if it's fiction or nonfiction, action or drama, war or peace, in big cities or small towns, in victory or defeat. It is all about character. So when we, you, me, our audience, our collaborators, our clients, know who the protagonist is and what he or she wants in any length or context of any kind of story, we are on board with that character's journey. Our brains are hardwired for it. It is the character that incites us to binge watch or change that channel. Think about Thelma and Louise, Black Klansman, the notorious RBG, who maybe used some Beats headphones, we're not sure. Erin Brockovich, maybe Rafferty, sure, I don't know. We can talk about that later. Erin Brockovich, Jerry Maguire, Harriet, the whistleblower, Rocky, Thurgood Marshall. Character is everything. And when we get character right, we get the heart and soul of the story. We connect, our customers, our audiences connect to story through character. So to better understand how to drive any story forward, we need to deep dive into character DNA. Before we take that plunge, let's understand that as the writers and as the storytellers, we are also wired to complicate things. So if we are complicating an already complicated formula, the result is going to be what? More complication or a convoluted result. Therefore, I look at the foundational concepts first, and then we can always build from there on the parts that excites us. So the 3 parts of character DNA are strengths, amnesia and superpowers. These are my terms now. Amnesia and superpowers, and what I call flossomeness. Let's look at Bourne. His strengths. He is super fit, determined, smart, resourceful, a polyglot who can kill someone with a paperclip. Those are his key 5 strengths. Now we could argue, we could add a few more to those. We could debate on, if there's one more important than the other, but the point is to notice that these are all within the context of the story of him recovering his memory. So now if he's a great ballroom dancer, homemade chicken pot pie maker, comes from a long line of blues legends, jazz legends. He played the Tin Man in his 4th grade play. We don't know any of these things. We don't hear about any of these things in the context of the Bourne Identity film because they're not strengths that are relevant to this story. Next, amnesia and superpowers. In the context of a film, a superpower is the attribute that specifically contributes to the hero or heroine overcoming the obstacles to achieving their goal. It is perhaps similar to what David Ogilvy called in the late 60s in his book on advertising, the unique selling proposition. A character's superpower is perhaps more unique, more distinctive, and maybe something that only they can do, or they do only in a particular context or set of circumstances. So Bourne's superpower, of course, in this film is his Black Ops training. We see it first on the park bench scene in the beginning of the film, where he is sleeping with the bullet holes still in his sweater, and he's waiting to get transportation to go find out what that chip is in his hip. We see it again when he escapes the embassy, and then throughout the film in various exploits. These are the traits that the context and circumstances of this story bring forward. And flawsomeness. It is a highly scientific calculation involving one's flaws and weaknesses, plus one's awesomeness. Flaws are, in film context, calls to action. They can also be calls to action in real life context. They add the dimension of reality and authenticity. Admitting to, accepting, or especially embracing flaws and weaknesses is a necessary part of character growth and of story arc, and it is much needed dimension in a story. If we look at Bourne, and anyone really, looking at character flaws is not about judging or criticizing. It's about taking an honest inventory about what will get in the way of a character reaching his or her goal. So Jason Bourne starts out with no memory. So he doesn't even know what he doesn't know. Both are weaknesses to his position and impede him from reaching his goal. On top of that, he has no friends or family. Clues that would be a big help to him. His debilitating flashbacks make him scared to know the truth. And when he does find out a little bit more about himself in the beginning of the story, it's that he's an assassin. Probably the biggest flaw or weakness you can have if you know nothing else about yourself. So if we think for a moment about how this influences the outcome of his story, it kind of goes like this. Here's a guy who wants to get his memory back and find out who he is. So he starts on that path, learns he's an assassin, and then doesn't really want to know anymore, wants to stop the flow of information. Then a little bit later on, he knows enough to want to change the people who made him who he finds himself out to be, so that he can change who he is now. That is the essence of character DNA. When we nail it and share these in each scene of a movie or part of a story or a narrative for any kind of organization, an audience can jump in anywhere and know, and more importantly, connect with that character. We see how these strengths, flaws, and superpowers play out over and over again, and we're connected to how they both advance and impede a story. This is what makes it dynamic. This is how we connect, grow, and facilitate growth on multiple levels in any story medium. This is how we move a story forward. So through these three elements, we have the chance to know, like, and trust the character. The Brigadier General said a great thing earlier. Trust is the currency of narrative battle. We've got to trust our characters, and we can't do that from being one-dimensional. or two-dimensional. So to engage in a story for 2 hours or follow a blog or watch all the sequels and do all these things, we must be informed. We are informed, we're entertained, we're engaged if we've done this right. So these 3 elements are the foundation of everything else. And let's consider what happens for a moment if one of these elements of character DNA is missing or disproportionate. So think for a moment if we just knew Bourne's strengths. If we had a whole 2-hour movie about his strengths, it would be the Village of the Happy People. Nobody pays $20 to see the Village of the Happy People. That is a phrase often heard at UCLA in the School of Theater, Film, and Television. Now, if it was just his weaknesses, it'd be a train wreck. We don't want to see that either. And if the story was just about his superpowers, it would be 1 or 2-dimensional. It is especially important in organizational, in complex storytelling that we move away from 2-dimensional storytelling and more toward 3-dimensional storytelling. 3-dimensional storytelling, can't even say it. So, and character is our fastest path to this next dimension, not to sound Star Trek-y, but strengths, flaws, superpower is the foundation to getting your characters known, liked, and trusted. If you get character DNA right, you are on your path to what I call story gold. This is where people follow you, they engage with you. Oftentimes, when a story is not working, it's an indication that is what I call it's undercooked. The story is undeveloped. It doesn't necessarily mean someone is on the wrong path, but the remedy is often more love and attention to the character. Thank you very much. If you'd like more information on ways to apply Jason Bourne and other heroes and heroines to your real life or your storytelling, feel free to come by and visit me at hollywoodapproach.com/NATO, and I'll send you some goodies.
Thank you so much, Kristina. That was thrilling. As soon as you mentioned flossomeness, I was thinking of the old comment that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. There's lots of comment about that, and NATO could be put in the same framework for sure, that it is the worst international security organization except for all the others, perhaps. So next up, I'm really glad to introduce Peter. So Peter Murray is joining us. He's the marketing director at Firaxis Games, the studio founded by legendary game designer Sid Meier. In addition to developing public relations campaigns, promotional events, and fan outreach, Mr. Murray has served on the development teams for 2 of the studio's flagship projects as a writer and associate producer, including serving as the writer on Sid Meier's Civilization VI expansion packs. He's an alumnus of the University of Maryland and Indiana University, Bloomington. Peter, thanks so much for being here.
Robert, thank you very much for the invitation. I'd like to thank the NATO Association of Canada for having me come today. So I'm bringing greetings from the Civilization team, and I'd like to begin by saying the presentation I'm going to show you today was developed with a lot of assistance from members of that team, specifically Ed Beach, who's the franchise lead designer, Dennis Shirk, who is the lead producer, and Brian Busati, who is the project art director for Civilization VI, which will be the case that I use for most of this study today. And one of the things that I want to begin with is kind of calling out how storytelling in video games is a little bit different, and it is that players have agency. Players can affect choices and change the way the story evolves. And so players are characters in this. We've talked about, KP's talk was great, talking about how characters in film are developed so that you gain some credibility with them. Rafferty's talked about how consumers are characters in a story that they're telling the why from. And the generals talked about how all of this is coming together in the stories that we're telling. Now I'm going to do is I'm going to take a video game and show very specifically how we facilitate a very organic kind of storytelling within that. So if you'll give me just a second. And specifically, we've got this idea of one more turn, how we create player engagement in a game like Sid Meier's Civilization VI. I do need to begin with a bit of a disclaimer, which is that our objective is to create a compelling video game that stands the test of time. So Civilization is a video game. We draw on the historical figures and events of history to help create this game, but the Civilization series has never been intended to teach history, make judgments about history or current events, or take positions on the same. So we're very happy that this has the game has become a springboard for people to discover a love of history, but we see ourselves primarily in the role of entertainers. If you're not familiar with Sid Meier's Civilization, let me tell you a little bit about it. It is a turn-based strategy game. So what that means is each player in the game does all of their actions and then play passes to the next person. Most of the board games you've played are turn-based. Monopoly is a turn-based game. Poker is a turn-based game. That's opposed to a game where all the action is happening concurrently. In Civilization, you're going to build beginning at the Stone Age and playing through an alternate history to the space age. Along the way, you're going to build the wonders of the world. You're going to research technology. You're going to develop culture, create works of art. You're going to interact with other civilizations through diplomacy, and including diplomacy by other means, which is war in some cases. And you're going to win the game by achieving victory in one of a number of domains. Either you're going to establish a new domestic or diplomatic order that's going to be in place around the world. You're going to achieve a technological victory by putting a colony on another planet, or your culture will become so dominant that everybody in the world wants to emulate you. And this has been a game that's been enjoyed by tens of millions of players around the world. And it's actually been in play for 30 years, which is pretty remarkable for a video game series. So what does that look like for 30 years? Well, if you had played Civilization in 1990, you would have been treated to state-of-the-art graphics, both in terms of your diplomacy with other leaders and its representation of the world. Well, 30 years later, things look a little more sophisticated. Graphics technology and the capabilities of modern PCs are absolutely phenomenal in terms of what they can do. Your diplomatic interactions with other leaders look a lot more animated now, although many of the fundamental design elements from that first Civilization game are still in place. And so each iteration of Civilization becomes a chance for us to make a new experience about creating that culture that goes from the Stone Age to the Space Age and finding new ways to present it to players. And boy, do players love Civilization. So part of what KP talked about was the number of hours people are spending on stuff. Here we've got a reviewer who put in 1,000 hours in the game, wrote down some quick thoughts about how they thought it went, and then went and logged another 33 hours right afterwards. Somebody who's put 2,000 hours into the game. And then there's this joke, I'm just going to do one thing in the game real quick, and then I'll be done. And before you know it, the sun has come up. So what is it that's making people say, one more turn? I just want to play, wait, one more turn, one more turn. Civilization is always about growth towards victory. Along the way, you have the ability to set your goals and pursue them, but you're always waiting for your next big step. Either you're building a new city, or you're waiting for a military unit to finish production, or you're waiting for a technology or a culture to come online that's going to take your strategy to the next step. And of course, no plan goes through unscathed. There's always things that are happening in the other game, from the other players in the game that you need to respond to, because they're trying to win the game as well. At the start of the game, the set of choices that a player has is fairly limited, but each choice that you make unlocks new possibilities for you. So here's a screenshot. This is the technology tree. This is how people choose technologies that they're going to research in Civilization. This is from the beginning of the game. And here you've got some fairly simple choices. Do I want to research mining? Because that's going to lead me to bronze working eventually, and maybe I can build some more spearmen so I can protect my people better. Or do I choose pottery, which will allow me to build a granary in one of my cities, which means its population will grow faster, which means I can spread out wider across the landscape. You have to balance these trade-offs against each other and these opportunity costs. And then you can research later technologies like writing, which will allow you to build a campus and gain technology points even faster. And likewise, the map of the world is extremely important. So where you place your cities on this world map determines the resources that you have access to and the strategies that might be easier or harder to execute. So for example, this player is playing as China. Their capital is Xi'an here. It looks like they're about to build a campus, which is that district that allows them to research and get more science. And they've got a pretty good spot next to that capital, that highlighted tile. It has a +3 for science. That's pretty good. But over in the corner up to the northwest of there, you can see there's one that's +4 science. It's even better, but they don't have access to that right now. So does this player then choose to spend gold to buy that land? Do they put off building the campus for a little bit, knowing that it's going to be better? Or do they say it's not worth waiting that long? I need to put something in place now. The visuals in Civilization are always important, but they're made in service to the gameplay. And each project's art director makes choices for what they're going to choose to emphasize. And in the case of Civilization 6, the choice that we made was for an approachable and vibrant design. But in practical terms, for a video game, this always comes down to the concept of readability, making sure players can discern information quickly without really having to dig for it. And I can give you a practical example taken out of the game. So here is an early game city, and I, as an experienced Civilization player, can look at this and I can say, oh, this city has already built a monument, which is that obelisk there. So they're producing a lot of culture with that. And they've built that granary, which means they've researched pottery. And I can look at this rice field next to the city, and I can say, okay, this player might be going in a culture and growth direction because they've chosen to emphasize that early on. So that tells me something about what this player's choices are. But even in a later game, the art choices give you a lot of information, even when the scene is relatively complex. So I can see Mount Kilimanjaro, that's that snow-capped volcano right there near this city. I can also tell something about this civilization that they've chosen to emphasize technology again. They've got a fully developed campus. But this thing in between the city and the campus is actually Oxford University. So they've built Oxford University. And they've built a spaceport in the south there. So this is probably a civ that's driving towards that technology victory. But if I look closely, I can see that there are 2 tanks and an anti-armor unit near that other civilization in the north, which has a different color border, which means it belongs to somebody else. So maybe there's a war about to break out here, and I can get all that just from the visuals of this. In our game, we emphasize things like we're not going for realistic proportions. We're emphasizing weapons because that tells you a lot of information very quickly about how a war is going to go for you. If you've got swordsmen and the other guys got muskets, that's going to end badly for you. Because of the isometric camera, that high angle camera, we emphasize torsos and arms because that reads more easily. We actually reduce the size of horses. A horse is really, really big compared to a human being. You can shrink the size of a horse and put a human on top of it and still reads as a guy on horseback. And we try for personality on our units. So even this merchant, he's got the stick that he's trying to guide that camel on with, and his cart is loaded down, just as a way to sort of delight the players. But in our game, a civilization is actually just a toolkit of game mechanics. It's led by a ruler. It's got some intrinsic traits. It's got some options. We choose our leaders based on the aspirational qualities of the culture, things that represent either a high point of that civilization's best view of itself. A useful heuristic we discovered early on was who do they put on their money, because that actually gives you some indication as to who the cultural heroes for that group are. So each civilization has features that tip the way it plays, units and buildings and gameplay advantages. And these can bias the civilization in different ways. But the object is not to have players feeling like they're doing a lot of calculus. We want players to feel like they have a lot of really cool choices and they're competing between attractive options. Do I go with China because they get this advantage to building, they get the access to the Great Wall, which is going to help protect their civilization early on in the game? Do I choose America because later on in the game they can build Hollywood studios and really just kind of become this cultural powerhouse? Can I wait that long? We always want players to be picking between attractive alternatives. We try to rely on players' existing knowledge as much as we can. So we try to have some intuitive things in the game. For example, muskets are going to beat swordsmen. That should be a mechanic that's reflected accurately in the game. But Sid Meier actually has a really great maxim, and it's do your reading after the game is done. A player should sit down with even a rudimentary knowledge of history and be able to get traction in what it is that you're trying to present. And it turns out that works really well, even when you're working with a fairly esoteric civilization. So this is Phoenicia, which we added in Civilization 6. And Phoenicia is probably not the first civilization that came into mind when I said civilization to you. And if you remember them vaguely from high school history class, you might remember kind of a Mediterranean powerhouse. They had some cities around that area, something about Carthage, maybe. Okay, well, you already know they've got ships. They're famous for their ships. They're famous for their ports. This is the Caton, which was a actually incredibly technologically sophisticated for the time naval state base that the Phoenicians would build. And they controlled the supply of purple dye in the region. And they were fantastic merchants. So we're going to build that into the toolkit that's Phoenicia in Civilization 6. All right, I've talked a lot about details and mechanics and how things play. Where does the story come into? And the story is the story that the players tell themselves. And in Civilization, it's actually simple systems working together that become the story. So when players talk about a civilization game, you don't hear them talk about, I made this choice to build this campus on this +3 tile versus this +4 tile. They talk about the plan, how they made the plan, how they carried it out, and how they responded to the world around them. The exact mechanics of it don't matter. They are a character in their game. It's their goal that they're trying to achieve and how they executed it. And even when it didn't work out, there can be an amusing story to tell in that. And so Civilization becomes this wonderful game where you recombine history in all sorts of different ways. Maybe the Mongols built the terracotta army in the Great Pyramids of Giza in the shadow of a delicate arch, but it's always about the history that the players created for themselves, not how they manipulated the individual tiles or the production priorities of various cities. Maybe they were playing Indonesia, and so they built the great Colossus of Rhodes in order to improve the yields of these fish tiles that they were working, but they made their city grow too big, so they had to build the Colosseum for happiness. No, the story becomes, I was this great naval power, Indonesia. I was developing my waters. My fleets were going around the world. I was growing too fast. I had to keep my people happy. I built the Colosseum there. Or maybe you're Canada. You play as Canada in Civ. You've achieved cultural domination because not only were you able to build Broadway in Toronto, but you were able to unite the world through a shared love of hockey. And this led to you becoming the cultural powerhouse of the world. All of this arises organically through simple systems that are just keeping players engaged, waiting for the next thing to happen, seeing how their plan is going to execute, and seeing how the plan changes for just one more turn. So thank you very much. I appreciate you giving us the opportunity to talk about this. It's always fun to talk about how very simple systems lead to these stories that people develop. And as I was listening to the other speakers, I was just impressed. We all came at these same ideas, people inserting themselves in a story, finding a reason, finding meaning, creating that, and all these different ways coming together for that. So thank you very much, Robert. This was a great chance to share a stage with some really fantastic people.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that you're quite right. Everybody's approached this, not surprisingly, from different points of view. And so now comes the really fun part where we get to try to mix those together. We have a half hour to do this in. And at that point, at 11:15, we will be starting some workshops where those who are listening right now live on YouTube will be able to join into different rooms and interact with groups from about 5 to 10 or so. So it's a real proper discussion. So hopefully the next Zoom room, the link will be put into the YouTube link so that everybody can get that and join us at 11:15. But for the next half hour, I'm just going to start with one question, a similar question to one that we'll be considering in our workshops. And then Rafferty Jackson, one of our program editors at the NATO Association, will be asking some of the questions that we have from YouTube and other sources. So my first question is just a little one to dance around the idea of one of the great stories of NATO is a story of peace, of successfully maintaining peace. And I know that individually, all of the speakers today have kind of grappled with this idea that peace is a difficult story. If you're just leaving that as kind of a foundational idea that what we're seeking is peace, that is our goal. That is one of the things that NATO has been so successful, is maintaining peace for the past 71 years. But peace isn't very exciting. The land of the happy people, were you saying, Kristina? That's not a good story, or it's challenging, because if it bleeds, it leads. News is made up of things that happen. You don't have reporters, in front of a successful square saying, well, nothing happened here today. People went about their business and flourished. They enjoyed their coffee. They had, big conversations with their friends, and everybody's happy. That is not a story that gets told very often. So how can we, I'm just interested, from your points of view, how can you tell that story in a way that gets people emotive and draws them in? This is open. I know several of you have thoughts on this.
I might first go ahead and jump in there, since we were talking about the village of the happy people. And as I'm doing talks around right now, a lot of people are like, whoa, just a second. I would like to hear more stories about the village of the happy people. I think things like Hallmark Christmas movies and other types of gentler content, if you will, are very popular right now. So I'll just kind of preface with that. But also, I think that's a question, I think, even more of execution, in terms of who are the characters that are maintaining the peace? It's such a big topic, right? But like, what types of measures were put into place in history? What kinds of obstacles came up in history that maybe today in modern times, maybe we assume, or the royal and general, we maybe take a little bit more advantage because, or take for granted because it's assumed, and it's something that has been in place for a long time. But it might be an opportunity to look at past characters and obstacles that they faced that are maybe, easier to maintain today, but appreciating what was, and also the types of pursuits. And I'm thinking now in Jason Bourne, because we've been talking about that this morning, but the actions that are required to maintain peace and harmony. Because for a lot of characters in real life, we are seeking peace and harmony in our own real lives, in our homes, as we share our homes with our whole family and fight over the Wi-Fi to do our thing on a daily basis. There are different areas, and I don't want to say struggles, but there are struggles and obstacles, or maybe it's more of a maintenance thing, and maybe there's some opportunity to look at previous stories. And with that, I will hand off to whoever wants to raise their hand next.
So one of the things that struck me is with Kristina saying that our audiences are very sophisticated consumers of stories. When you have a story of peace, implicit with that is the idea that peace is important and it had to come from somewhere, and who are we keeping the peace from? So a story about keeping peace is ultimately going to be an adversarial story in some way. So if I'm saying I've been able to keep the peace for 50 years, we'll keep the peace from who? In a case where you've got NATO, which is a military alliance, there's a very clear-cut military adversary that you're saying, well, okay, tanks have not come down the fold of a gap for a long time. There's a reason why. But we have, and I think there's been an increasing effort to say, okay, there is an adversary out there who's using the tools that we see as being, the legacy of a democracy against us in some specific ways as well too. But I think going to an audience and saying peace is important, peace is a reason, but this is the circumstances that led to the peace arising, and these are the people that don't want to see that happen. I think that becomes part of the story that you would need to tell around that as well too.
From a business point of view, the first thing I would tackle would be the lexicon. What does the word peace mean in the context of this particular culture? So lexicon is challenging within businesses because everybody has a different point of view on a word. And if that word is actually part of your why, you better all be on the same page as to what peace means. So for NATO, peace is the absence of what, and then the presence of what. I think that would be a critical first step. Even if we look at here in the United States, we just celebrated Thanksgiving, and it's notorious for family dinners on Thanksgiving to be possibly challenging. For, you hear words like, oh, we have to make peace with, Uncle so-and-so or cousin such and what. But if you even think about that dinner, in that house where they had dinner, even if there had been fights, outside of that house was peace. If we go back to what Peter just said, tanks did not go up and down the street. But within that house, some people might have experienced something that felt like unsafety, like lack of peace. So to start from a business point of view, if you think about that whiteboard that I was standing in front of where you could see I'd been taking input from people, the first place I would start is, what do the words peace, prosperity, and security mean? And maybe taking from Peter's page, what is the history of those words? And then taking from Kristina's page, what is the future of where we're trying to go? So how do you take both that civilization point of view and then that Hollywood future story, and then make sure we're all on the same page, that when somebody at NATO, says peace, there's a universal meaning among all the people using that word, so that lexicon can sit and then that story stays the same every time it's employed.
General Janzen?
I think there could be a temptation to go for the easy story for NATO, and that is, Cold War. Attractive narrative, lots of movies like War Games, Red Dawn. This was the stuff stories were made of, and we could go back to that, but we would be making a large mistake in that it would be contrary to the objectives that we're trying to accomplish. Demonizing a certain nation when you're trying to establish international understanding and collective security, not a good option. So I think we have to look for other stories, other struggles, other sort of unique character aspects to highlight. Perhaps the struggle for technology, and the need to have remotely piloted systems to gather information, not only about military things, but perhaps about climate change. The story about how can 30 different nations actually work closely together. There's nothing more complex than things like military maneuvering or logistics chains. How do what is that system, that civilization-like system that makes it all work together? And if we can find stories like that that actually highlight our objectives of unity and collective security, then we'll be onto something.
Peter, did you have a point?
I thought that was an excellent point that the General Janzen said about not limiting the story of NATO to the Cold War, and perhaps I was too glib to do that. But I do think there are ways that you can cast the history of NATO, the story of NATO, the development of NATO, and then its direction, especially when you have a future that you're going towards where things like the expansion of NATO, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and territories that were formerly under that control, saying, no, actually, we believe in the mission that NATO has and recognize that the role that plays, that's a huge story to tell too. And so I do think there is a lot in the NATO story that comes together, how it has evolved over time, that can be used for that. It is a story of people who were formerly adversaries, and now they're coming together with that. And I think that does a lot for NATO as an organization, because it does say we are not an organization based on a particular national identity or a very hard dictation of how you should structure your country. It does open it up and it says, no, we have this larger set of values, which we believe are human values that we want to share with the world at large. And I think that's an excellent touchstone to build on.
All right, well, I'll pass it on to Rafferty Jackson. Please go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you, Robert. I do encourage everyone to actually ask questions in the chat. I will be presenting questions in trios. So the first trio of questions is it possible to create a character DNA centered around the why? Followed by video games and streaming platforms are a great medium for creating communities and bringing people together. How do video games make people feel as though they belong to something greater than themselves? And finally, when we are talking about storytelling and NATO, it is difficult to avoid the image of propaganda. How may we avoid the negative connotations of propaganda while telling the story? So to begin with DNA, Kristina or Rafferty, would you give your input?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I'd love to hear what Rafferty thinks about this as well. I would say that, could you repeat? I just want to make sure I have the context correct. Could you repeat the?
For sure. Is it possible to create a character DNA centered around the why?
Okay, so a character DNA centered around the why. I think it's sort of like, the way I look at character DNA is a minimum of the three components that I talked about: the strengths, flossomeness, and superpowers. And I think the why, I mean, we may be splitting hairs a little bit here, but I think the why kind of has boundaries within that, within the character DNA, as well as within the goal. Because when the character is coupled with the goal, so we see in the Jason Bourne example, his goal is to get is to recover his memory. And if it's all centered about the why, I mean, so we think about that, like the why is a key driver to a story. It really is a key driver. It's a key driver to character and what strengths and flossomeness may come out, and also what superpowers may come out, especially when it's, when they're under pressure to achieve this goal. We can all probably relate to a moment in our life where maybe we felt we were losing our identity a little bit. Maybe we were in a situation or an organization or a role or something where we just felt like, wow, this is such an intense situation. It's bringing out different aspects of strengths and flaws than before. And so maybe we feel a little bit disconnected with ourselves. So we can relate to Jason Bourne on that level. And then driving that for him in that particular situation is a lack of a fundamental identity. How can he do anything, move forward at all? Like, you can't just forget that you're a 30-something-year-old man and just be like, well, whatever, I'll just go to the beach now. Like, you're really driven at a core level for that fundamental component of life. So I would use that as a way to answer the question. I think the why is a really driving force, and the stronger the why, the stronger the drive toward the goal, and probably the more intense the strengths, flossomeness, and superpowers are amped up, which again adds drive and stakes to the story.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Jackson?
So I would take what Kristina is proposing on the three elements of a character and think about applying that to the three words: peace, prosperity, and security. Because if you think about peace, I'm a science fiction fan. So if you've read Brave New World or 1984, dark dystopian novels where individuality and your ability to make choices have been severely limited, but technically there's peace. And I think that's where you get into a difficulty on whys that are so big in concept and haven't been broken down into kind of guardrails of what each word means. So does peace to NATO mean peace to the point where you would strip individuality and human rights? No, that's a guardrail on the word peace for NATO. And I think if you took what Kristina is proposing with the, the strengths and the flossomeness, and you sort of wove that under each one of those words, you would end up with some really clear guardrails under those words that would help that storytelling always align. So that's where I think how you could combine the character. I don't do character work, but I appreciate the discipline that she's trying to drive. And if you take each one of those and kind of drive it into that element of each why, you might end up in a situation where that storytelling pulls stronger. Although I have to tell you, after listening to Brigadier-General Janzen, part of me wants to lean into the negative stories because they're going to land, and as a business person, I'd say, gee, if our goal is to sell NATO as much as possible, not propaganda, but just sell the story of it, part of me leans into, well, maybe you tell the negative of, if peace is not stripping people's human rights, maybe we should be talking about stripping people's human rights, and that's not what we do. But that's how I would think about blending in that character DNA.
Great. General Janzen, would you like to comment?
Yes, interesting discussion. I think that getting at your last question on how do we know whether we're sucked into propaganda ourselves or whether we're dealing with effective storytelling. I think I would say the key difference is propaganda primarily focuses on an adversary and it's directed at somebody else. So my advice for NATO would be to stick to our values, stick to our story. And you look at what the Kremlin is doing, for an example, one of their key stories is the West are fascists. And they're not out there telling the story about why things in the Russian Federation are so great. No, their key story is the West are aggressive fascists, and we need to be very careful. On the contrary, what is the NATO story? What is our strength? I think our superpower maybe is our military might, but we have to be careful with that. But our flossomeness, I like that word too. I think maybe that's the space we really need to work in. And as much baggage that the alliance has, and sometimes we have divisions between allies. However, NATO is the only forum where there are daily diplomatic discussions between nations from both North America and Europe together, daily. NATO's key flossomeness is in those diplomatic discussions, in the de-escalation. And in terms of defining our language and getting it right, I don't think we have to look any further than the Atlantic Treaty, which starts out by saying that the parties to this treaty affirm their desire to live in peace with all peoples and all governments. They're determined to safeguard the freedom, common heritage, and civilization, that's for you, Peter, of their peoples, founded on the principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. So there's probably something in there for us to work with.
That's great. And Mr. Murray, would you like to comment as well?
Not that hasn't been said or better by other people on this. And no, I think that's an excellent summation of those points. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. So we'll go on to the next trio of questions. So how can institutions counter this kind of propaganda? So this is referring to disinformation mentioned by General Janzen. Can organizations like NATO work with private companies such as Twitter and Facebook to counter these forces? NATO has had its way for many years, but it has not told its story. So what steps must a company or organization such as NATO take after it has its why? And finally, what might NATO's story look like if it's told through sociological storytelling techniques? For example, early Game of Thrones seasons that emphasize situations and institutions that more than singular heroes.
I want to pick up something that I believe Rafferty said earlier, which is this idea of trust as currency. And I think that's going to be particularly key as we move forward through that. I think we look at the ways that people generate trust through, honest and dishonest means. That's important as well too. This idea of creating a coherent narrative that you can scaffold, an explanation on is important. That gets into this idea of, how does Game of Thrones set up the world? Well, they, here's all the things. Here's the watch. Here's the, the wall. The whole first season is done to just basically establish the world that you're in. And then, getting into some of these ideas from video games, once you've given players a basic awareness of what they know, you work within the framework of that as well too. I think there's a lot that needs to be done to build up honest brokers of information, people who are willing to build a credibility with their audience and are willing to, take positions with their audience or help their audience try to understand things. In the case of like a video game streamer audience, that's people watching somebody play a game that they like. Well, they could be playing that game. Why are they watching somebody else play a game that they nominally enjoy? Well, maybe they like the way the person explains that better, or maybe they want to be in part of that person's story. They want to witness that story as well too. And I think that has important lessons in terms of how you bring that audience to that emotional space, not just a facts-based space, but an emotional space where it's resonant with them. Building up that ethos, that idea of ethos in what General Janzen said at the start of his talk, going all the way back to Aristotle.
He's still good.
I'm telling you, we've never really gotten past Aristotle. That's
Okay, Kristina, would you like to comment on one of the questions?
Sure. I would, speaking of Aristotle, one of his other favorite quotes is, "Those who tell the stories rule the world." And I think to General Janzen's point about the propaganda, being out there and NATO needing to raise its voice and tell its story is a key component. Like the systemization and the opportunity to use your voice and raise your voice to tell your story. Going back for a moment when I used to play intramural volleyball, like in Chicago, we got in a tough spot one day and we were just getting crushed by our opponents, and we took a timeout and someone's like, "Play your game." Somebody on our team was just like, "Play your game, play your game." And so we were all like, oh yeah, that's right. Okay, I'm a spiker and you're a setter. So set, spike. We know how to do this, but in a moment we kind of are just reacting or freezing to the game at hand. And so I think it's important to step back up, play your game, tell your story, go on the offensive, and then systematize it. There's a lot of work to be done to explore the why and the guardrails. I love what you're saying about those, Rafferty. Absolutely, it gives you some guidelines and boundaries to create that space for what your storytelling can look like in this modern time, and how that then should be carried out and executed, how and where and what tone you take, and all of those kind of things. Creating a head writer type of position or type of narrative, a show Bible is what we call it in Hollywood, that would feature the guardrails and the areas to measure what is the narrative and where are you on point versus where might something need a little more development. So I think it's a very exciting opportunity to me. I guess maybe that's me, nerdy me as a writer. It's an exciting opportunity to, to think about creating that and what that can mean for your organization.
Ms. Jackson.
What was the last question? The sociology or sociological? What was the question?
So the last one was around Game of Thrones. So what might NATO's story look like if it's told through sociological storytelling techniques, such as early Game of Thrones, that emphasizes situations and institutions more than singular heroes?
Yeah, singular heroes is really, that's a tough question for a lot of different reasons. Here's a great example. Kristina told her story through the single hero. And we know the hero's journey, right? That story we have heard since we were knee high. Almost every, childhood story is a hero's journey story, and that sort of singular hero. So what we learned at Beats by Dre was we could have told the story through Dr. Dre, just told the story through him. He's considered the single most important person in the advent of hip hop, one of the most important cultural forms of music for this generation. There's a lot of challenges, though, with that single hero story over time. It works at a moment in time, but not over time. And one of the things we knew when we were building Dr. Dre was, Beats by Dre, was we had to stay relevant to all of the stories and micro stories and macro stories happening. So if you look at somebody like Dr. Dre and go back to that photo where he's next to Lady Gaga, it's, you can't, within music, it's very difficult to get further apart from each other. Very different people playing to very different audiences. But by aggregating all those sort of individual hero stories into more of a situational story, Beats landed in a way that we could have a consumer who was, the 70-year-old retired, very successful business person in first class could be wearing Beats headphones, all the way down to the person in the back in the economy seat of a plane who's got a backpack and is getting ready to travel the world on, all the money they've saved could have on Beats headphones. That was because we had to broaden off of the single hero story of Dre and make sure we were staying on in our case, because we were tied to music, quite a few single hero stories that came together to tell a situational story. So I imagine going back to what the Brigadier General said when he called out that one officer that had done so well and had sort of become a hero at that moment in time. His story is that moment in time, but the situational story, back to what you were saying, Peter, the simple systems working together is actually going to end up being the elevated long-term story, I believe, of NATO versus individual stories.
We could try to use Game of Thrones techniques in NATO. I think the nudity would be way less flattering for starters. But just to Rafferty's point, you can try to tell that big institutional story, but you better have some heroes that hold it up. So, and NATO's got lots to choose from. I mean, we can have the institutional leaders, the Secretary General, the Supreme Allied Commander. I mean, that's a cool title in and of itself, right? We've got different, powerful women. We've got people from 30 different nations. And I actually think that NATO, you got to give them credit where credit's due. Like campaigns like the We Are NATO campaign, I think that they are attempting to leverage a lot of what we're talking about today. But they are a bureaucracy. I think perhaps one thing that could be done is empowering truly creative people, pushing that power to the edge and letting them go and take some risks. And I think of, we don't think often of the United Nations as being a trendsetter either in terms of communication, but look at what UNICEF has done over the years with their leveraging of celebrities. And, they've had some incredible campaigns because they let somebody else tell their story in a way that they used their words. They weren't limited by that sort of bureaucratic corporate mindset. And they saw quite a bit of success. So that's something for NATO to think about as well.
I think that's a very good point. And I'm afraid we're going to have to cut it short there, although I'm sure we could go on for ages. I can't thank you all enough, Rafferty, Jay, Peter, Kristina, and Ravdeep, for helping to put this together. a great discussion. And I really hope that each of you will join us as we continue this discussion early next year. We really want to push this idea out there and play elegantly with these different possibilities. Who knows, a NATO video game, a NATO movie, the sky's the limit. But right now, I don't know, I think maybe one or two of our panelists may join us, but in the YouTube access portal, there will be a Zoom link that you can all use to join us for a quick workshop of half an hour to try to pound out some other thoughts on this and to include a larger group. So these will be intimate conversations between 5 or 10 people with some great people leading us through the discussions. So to our panelists, thanks so much. Ravdeep, great job. And we look forward to seeing you in the future. It's really a great time.